I'm Corinne Schaefer, and welcome to Create Outside the Box. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Renaissance man Hank Smith about clowning around, tap dancing, and how he got to Sesame Street. If you're interested in watching our conversation, please visit our Creative Operations YouTube channel under the playlist Create Outside the Box. Hank Smith has done mime, clowning, dance, photography, video, and television production. For 20 years, he was a stage manager on Sesame Street, also functioning as associate director, actor, and choreographer. As a tap dancer and educator, he has participated in the New York Committee to celebrate National Tap Dance Day's Tap Extravaganza, the tradition in tap experiences, New York Tap City, New Jersey Tap Festival, and Tap Family Reunion. His The Story of Tap was presented at Dixon Place between 1998 and 2018. He is the recipient of the 2019 Tap Preservation Award, and his performance work has been presented in and around the New York City area. His photography appears in the documentary Mr. Soul, about the groundbreaking producer Ellis Hazlitt. An associate professor emeritus at Bloomfield College, New Jersey, he is currently hosting the online one-on-one conversation series, Hangin' with Hank. So hello, Hank, and welcome to Create Outside the Box. Thank you for coming on today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
So I normally start off the podcast, especially if I know someone, with how we met. So do you want to explain how we had our chance encounter?
Well, in the town of Keyport, where I live, there's this woman named Aja, who I call the social director. She's the glue. She knows everybody. So she had mentioned to me in an email, oh, I met this woman who's an opera singer. You need to meet her, blah, 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 blah. So on a regular basis, a lot of us get together for lunch and hang out. And I believe it was at one of those lunch things where we met. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was at one of our artist lunches. And Asya has a lot of talents, but one of her main talents is just connecting people. And she's such a huge supporter of everybody. And if people want to learn more about Asya, she's episode 2, season 2. So you can check out her interview. But we're going to get back to Hank. I know that you're a born and bred New Yorker. Who's since retired to Keyport. But growing up in New York City, how did that affect and inspire you as an artist?
Well, as a native New Yorker, that's my hometown. So you take a lot for granted, thinking the rest of the country's like New York, which it isn't, right? Mm-hmm. And I grew up in the Bronx. So like any place you grow up in, that's what you know. Mm-hmm. That's your town. So. But for me, I grew up in the Bronx. My father's a native New Yorker. He was born in the early, 1906, so he grew up in New York way back. Mother from Virginia. We lived in the Bronx, but because my mother loved the arts, my father loved music and stuff, so I went downtown a lot, which in terms of New York City meant going into Manhattan. He went downtown, so my mother would take me down there to the Radio City Music Hall to see things. Of course, I grew up in an era in the 50s where there was a lot on television, so a lot of variety shows. The interesting thing is the Ed Sullivan Show, which was a popular show at the time, a big variety show, based in New York, and often acts that might have been at the Radio City Music Hall performed on the Ed Sullivan Show, so I got to see them there. So the idea of growing up in New York City, you have access to so much, and with theater and television and film and the arts, it's kind of a backdrop that as I got older, I availed myself of the opportunities of the 5 boroughs.
Exactly. And getting to my next question, the definition of a Renaissance man is somebody who has multiple talents and knowledge in multiple disciplines. And it's not uncommon for artists to be skilled, in multiple disciplines. We've all heard of the triple threat. but you really break the mold. I mean, you have so many different, no, seriously, there's so many different facets. We're actually not even getting into everything that you do in the conversation because it would be 4 hours. But I just thought, it might be interesting for people, to maybe hear like how you got interested in these things, or was it something about your personality or your upbringing or just the way life brought you that you ended up developing interests and skills in all of these different components that we're going to discuss today?
It's an interesting question that I've been trying to figure out for the past over years. My father, who grew up in New York, his job, he was a linotype operator. That's what he did for a living. But he told me stories of all these different jobs he had when he was coming up. That's the term he would use, to earn a living. He did all these different things. And I was always fascinated by those stories of all the different jobs he had and all the different things he did. And I think that's one thing that affected me in terms of broadening the scope of what you could do. I originally wanted to be an architect. That was my original plan. But I had always been interested in show business and television and film as something to watch and as a consumer. I was also interested behind the scenes too, but I never thought about it as something to do on my own. So I think I always had an interest in different things, but I was pretty much on this track. I wanted to be an architect, and that was because I liked building things. I also was kind of good at art. So that was a track I was on, but I think I had a natural interest in different things. My father did photography. He had a 16 millimeter camera, which I still have. He shot footage of New York and Harlem in the 1940s. And our family films were shot on 16 millimeter, not 8 millimeter. So that was an influence. But for me, it was just like a regular thing. Now I think back on it, my father's a filmmaker, but so this was part of what was there. He gave me my first camera, which I still have, a Brownie, taught me about photography, what to do. My mother, grew up in Virginia, and she actually grew up in a fairly well-to-do background, and she talked about meeting and going to see Marian Anderson when she was young. And she talked a lot. So the conversations, and both my parents, when they were courting in New York, they'd be seeing Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong. My father collected soundies. Now soundies, these short films that you can see on YouTube. Back in the day, you couldn't get my father, we had two 16 millimeter projectors. My father collected the soundies and would show these films in our living room. We would look at Fats Waller, King Cole Trio. So what I'm getting, I was just affected by all of this. So as I moved into my majority, I guess meaning my 20s, and I wound up shifting gears because I flunked out of engineering school and the war kicked in, and I decided to transfer to NYU. And well, I'm interested in TV and film. Let me just study that. So I started to do that there. And then this is in the 60s. And then while I was studying at NYU, I had a job at NBC as a page when The Tonight Show was there, and I was exposed to a lot. So my track then was I want to be a director of variety shows, because I always loved variety shows. As a kid, I'd studied tap, but never thought of that as something I'd do for a living. And while I was on NBC, since you couldn't just suddenly become a director, and this is before you had video or whatever, I got a camera and just started taking a lot of photographs of people. So along the years, between all these different things, it's always been, I think about it now, and it's to quote Malcolm X, I've just been interested in creative stuff by any means necessary. Just to do different things. And the thing, as I'm doing it, I'm just doing it. In retrospect, my goodness, but it wasn't like I'm going to be multifaceted. Let me try this, let me try that, let me, do whatever. And I joke with people, I've always considered myself kind of a lazy, non-aggressive, assertive person, but an old friend of mine said, yeah, but you've always been very steady, So.
Yeah. And slow and steady wins the race, right?
Yeah, I think another part of it is, I'm a generation where when it comes to African American performers, Sammy Davis, Sidney Poitier, they were the breakthrough people. I was in college in the 60s when suddenly the term black became popular. So I was in the midst of this change about Black identity or whatever. And I think part of my thing was, as an African American, as a young Black man, to not be pigeonholed in any particular way. I don't know if I consciously, super consciously thought about that, but that had something to do with it.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't want to do something that any group told me I should be doing. I just wanted to plug along, which wasn't always easy, but I'm just saying that has something to do with it too.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. I also like this kind of is giving like an overview of some of the topics and some of the life experiences that we're going to delve into. I want to start with architecture school and studying engineering. Now, do you use your engineering brain when you're approaching artistic projects? Are you using like the strategy and design and problem solving aspects of that?
Very good point, because I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of how am I wired, right? And I think when I think about it, I love putting things together. I always love it, whether it's a party, whether it's a tap routine, it's structuring things, putting stuff together. My basis as a performer was in the part of mime. I was a mime for a while. And I was going out with someone who's related to her brother. No, it's a friend of mine. Her brother was an architect. And I remember meeting him. Now, this is in the 70s when I wasn't doing architecture, I was performing as a mime. And I was talking to him and saying, well, I wanted to be an architect, but now I'm a mime, which has got nothing to do with that. And he says, no, I disagree. And I said, how do you disagree? Well, an architect, there's an empty space and fills that space with a structure, sees something and creates something. He says, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
When you're doing, put it together. So I think that frame of mind, you know, in terms of engineering or figuring things out, I was always good in calculus and algebra, because there it was. I think that does come to play in terms of, I love editing things, which you can appreciate. How do you put it together? So I think that's got something, it's a bit of a connection there.
Yeah. No, it's great, because I think I'm not mathematically minded. I was more of like the English history side of things. And I think that artists are often stereotyped as being that, but there are a lot of artists that thrive in the math and science worlds. And there is a huge component to that in all performing arts and even visual arts that should be represented and spoken about. You were mentioning after architecture school, you decided to go to NYU to study production and your interest in variety shows. We know from watching all of these shows as kids and being exposed to all of the different performers that you were, that's how you got interested in variety shows. But did you want to actually be a director and producer of shows? Like, what got you into studying production at NYU?
I wanted to direct variety shows. You know, I wanted to because and that was a major form on TV at the time. I mean, now a variation over these song shows that people compete or late night shows, but I just loved the production of it all, and also love performers. Now, I didn't realize. I tell people, deep down inside me, I really wanted to perform. But I think it freaked me out. So I wanted to direct, and when I got the job at NBC, and again, this is in the mid-'60s, I hung around. There was a famous production team, Dwight Hemian and Gary Smith. Gary Smith was the producer. Dwight Hemian directed Kraft Music Hall, all those things. And I used to watch him, and I loved, again, putting all the elements together, the set, the staging, what cameras do you use? What angles do you use? Even today, I criticize television directing now because it's too crazy. They don't really know what they're doing. They're shooting cameras all over the place and stuff. How do you create something? So it was that aspect of it, putting it together. And I will admit, there's a part of me that likes being God. You know, which is not really what a director does, but the idea of it, you know, being the one that pulls it all together. You know, I used to tell people, the reason I want to direct is I love those photos of directors on sets kind of like, So part of it was the idea of it, but I think that was the thing. But one day I had a realization. I had a realization about what I really wanted to do.
Oh gosh. Okay. Before we get to that, I just wanted to like back up a minute because I totally get it. I think there's a lot of artists that once they get a taste of like having some artistic control and creating a world for people to step into, it is addictive. So I do understand that. But what to you makes variety shows? Like it wasn't necessarily just a TV show or a movie. What about variety shows were you so inspired by? What was so special about it?
Well, at the time, anything having to do with drama totally intimidated me, so I never thought of that. And variety shows are things I love to watch because you'd see a tap dance, you see a juggler, you see a singer. It was the idea of the variety and the entertainment of it and putting it together. And it was exciting. You know, back when the Oscars came on, that's the only time you saw actors out of the realm of being in a movie. So I think it was the specialness of it. And particularly in the 60s when it got more creative, there was a creative possibilities. If you have a singer, you just have them sit on a podium, you create a scene for them. You can understand this, right? You create a scene. What can you do with a little bit to seem like it's a lot?
Yeah.
You know, and I was fascinated by camera angles and all of that to create create the fun. How do you create the excitement of a performance that if you're not live, if you're doing on it, which is still of interest to me.
Yeah.
So that had, as I think about it, that had a lot to do with it. And I would see all these performers I loved, and I think I wanted to be able to if I'm not going to sing, at least I get to work with singers or dancers.
Well, speaking of, working with interesting and creative and important people, which you've worked with a lot, while you were at NYU, you had a very special teacher, Martin Scorsese. This is kind of amazing to me. How was Martin Scorsese as a teacher? What did he teach? And do you have any stories that you would care to share?
Well, this is funny because when I decided to transfer to NYU, and that's mainly because the Vietnam War had kicked in, I was going to night school after flunking out. I needed to be full-time to avoid the draft. So I decided to transfer to NYU. And this is before they had the School of the Arts. And the regular school had a major that was called TMR, which stood for Motion Pictures, Radio, Television, Motion Pictures, and Radio. And because film totally intimidated me, I was focusing on TV. So there was only one filmmaking class that I took. And I remember getting into class, and there was this young guy teaching who seemed not much older than me. And it turns out it was Martin Scorsese. So all I remember from the class was he was the nervous energy that he still has. When he talks, his enthusiasm. He has always had that. When I see him, I just remember him talking about stuff. He always said, "Don't use the handheld cameras. Do that." Other than that, I just remember, just vague memories of the class. It's more memories of after studying with him, noticing his name popping up. So his first film, Who's That Knocking with Zena Bethune? Oh, that's my filmmaker. My teacher. When the film Woodstock came out, I didn't go to Woodstock, but I went to see the movie Woodstock. And his name was on it as one of the editors, one of the camera people. And it turns out a lot of people in Woodstock were NYU folks, So, and then I was going out with somebody whose sister was going out with him at the time. And we all met up in the village. And I remember just talking to him about what was it like to shoot Woodstock. And then when I saw Mean Streets, I said, I think this guy's going to be, something. So in terms of the actual class, it's just a mixture of all the other NYU college stories. I don't have any particular stories about him other than I just remember the short guy in the front of the room,
Yeah, with a lot
being very passionate about stuff.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's insane. Before we get into your career as a tap dancer, I wanted to just kind of ask, how did you get into clown and miming?
So, again, early days of television. a lot of television was from vaudeville, right? They either took a lot of old movies on, and a lot of those acts on variety shows were vaudevillians. And a number of people, Sid Caesar, whatever, who are physical comedians. Red Skelton was physical. So pantomime, or that physicality, was something I saw on TV. So when I got it, after I worked at NBC as a page, I got a job at WPIX Channel 11 as an associate director. I got on staff. That's how I got in the Directors Guild. And again, the idea was, well, I'm an associate director. I still want to become a director of variety shows. If I'm going to direct performers, I need to learn about performing. I need to take some classes.
Okay.
So I went to a place called HB Studios, stood for Herbert Berghoff, who was married to Uta Hagen. The school is still in the West Village on Bank Street. So I went there and took some classes. And so I was at the time, now mind you, I'm like in my late 20s, right? Which at the time I'm thinking I'm old, but acting totally intimidated me. Oh, everybody's going to be better than me. Dancing intimidated me. But I looked at mime. Well, mime was a little bit of each. And how much better could anybody else be in the class than me? So I took a mime class just as, and I took to it. I liked it, It's like you could do your own thing. In other words, you create everything yourself. And then I studied with a guy named Michael Henry. And then a few years later, I studied with a woman named Renee Hutrides. And it was one of those moments when elements came together. A group of us who studied with her liked working with each other. She was a great teacher, and we formed a mime group, out of that class. And I got interested in it because, and I was at this point working in TV, freelancing as an AD, but the mime thing, theater was in you. You didn't need to audition. You just came up with stuff. And I liked that independent element. And then I was lucky, and I'm still friends with these people that I studied with. You collaborated with folks, and you just came up with things. And using your imagination, you create stuff. It's the same thing as an architect. You imagine something, you create it. So, and I had fun doing it. And again, Red Skelton, Dick Van Dyke, Sid Caesar, all those people I remember were physical comedians. And the mime group that we formed called Garden Variety was a very loud mime group. So we didn't do Mike Face or whatever. We just did silly, fun things. So that was, and that's basically my foundation as a performer is in mime, starting in my late 20s. And I studied with a great master named Tony Montanaro up in Maine, who really solidified things. And then, because I was doing a lot of research about African-American performers and African-American history of performing, when I found out about Burt Williams, it's kind of like, okay, because it's not like there were a hell of a lot of black mimes running around. So when I found out about Burt Williams, studying him, that also solidified something in terms of studying that art form and doing it.
Now, because as you mentioned, it is such a physical art form, you're using your body as an instrument to storytell, and you're in control of that. Did that ultimately lead you back into dance and into tap dancing?
Exactly. I'd always been, I was never an athlete because I didn't like team sports. I'm kind of like the individual thing, but I always liked moving around. So exactly, the confidence I got performing mime, and the fact that I was kind of good at it also gave me a little bit of like confidence. So at one point, when I was working Channel 11, I took a leave of absence and studied everything. I took a summer off, and this is in the 70s when it was still cheap to live in New York, and the dance explosion was starting to happen. So I was taking classes in fencing, in modern dance, a place called Clark Center, jazz dance, whatever. I just took classes all over the place, and then started taking some acting classes and speech classes. And then it was in my late 20s, I went, I want to tap again. I bought a pair of tap shoes and found a tap teacher and started to work with him to get back into tap dancing. I was in my late 20s and really didn't hit my stride till many years later, which is a whole other story, in my 50s when I got better at it. But yeah, it was the mime thing that gave me confidence to start doing all the other stuff. And a lot of stuff I learned in the mime class with Renee and Tony, I could apply to all the other performing skills in terms of, creating conditions for yourself, using your imagination, and the fact that, what the main thing I learned about mime is how the audience is part of the work. You set it up for the audience to fill in something else. You're doing all of this. I used to say, what am I doing? You're pulling a rope. There's no rope here.
Yeah.
You probably understand what I'm talking about. So, yeah, and the understanding of the body and space, and I wound up studying a lot of things once I moved into the clown world. But I studied a lot about the concept of the fool and the trickster and Delsart and the different parts of the body, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual. So if I use my fingertips like that, that's more intellectual. If you use the palms, that's emotional. If you use this, it's physical. So from this, all these kind of things. And the great actors know these things, The great performers, I love watching great performers, and when they see me doing nothing, they're like killing it.
Yeah. No, but I think that's so important. And, with my background as an opera singer and, in classical music, we weren't required, at least in my training, to take acting classes. I did do some acting as a kid, like straight plays and stuff like that. And I think I did, courses as a kid, also in pantomime. And it was good for your imagination, and it helped you get in your body. But as an actual training performer, we didn't have any acting classes. And I remember in one of the summer programs that I did, doing some work that sounds perhaps similar, maybe not to the depth that you had, where we would have to use masks, and we would have to lead ourselves from different sections of the body to convey different characters.
There you go.
And it's so helpful because if you see someone singing or performing or doing whatever, and they're not grounded physically in what they're doing and who they are, then they've lost the battle. If you set yourself up physically with where you need to be, you're already almost there because you've just set up the dominoes, and it's just going to go on. So I think there should actually be more of that. And I know sometimes as a kid, it feels a little silly to do some of these exercises, but it's really, really worthwhile.
Well, wasn't the old stereotype of the opera performer just a stiff person? There's just the voice, but there's really no acting going on. They just get from, one spot to the other. And then you have people like Callis or whatever that brought this other kind of excitement, because there was another element, So.
Yeah, we call it park and bark. You like and you bark. And that's not what you want.
Wow. I love it. Park? I got to tell a friend of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, so that work is so important. And as you said, that's why even when you have a stage animal like Callis, you can then see her in a recital where she's standing still, but all of that physicality and energy is informing the performance, even if she's standing,
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. But getting back into dance, you are a tap dancer. You are an educator in tap. You are also a historian. When it comes to tap dancing, you're very passionate about the preservation of this art form. And I just wanted to get into, why you love tap dancing so much and why you think that this art form is so important.
Well, it's really interesting because, again, I'm of a generation, I grew up, remember the 50s, and, civil rights and a lot of things were happening. And I also tell people, all of the racial problems, whatever, it's the system that's created this whole thing that can actually get people messed up and confused. Anyway, in terms of popular culture, by the time I was in college in the mid 60s or so, there was a period of time, and I'm not saying it's the case with all Black people, but tap dancing was considered, well, this entertaining thing, you smile or whatever for white folks, you know. It's connected to like Uncle Tom stuff. And it's the same period of time when people were talking about Step and Fetch It and Hattie McDaniels and putting them down for doing. And even when Sidney Poitier came along, he was getting flack for being too much of the nice guy, right? Now, again, not everybody felt that way, and not every Black person felt tap dancing, but that was a concept kind of floating around. And I remember as a kid loving the tap dance art form. And as I got into my 20s, I started doing a lot of research about Black performers, particularly the Step and Fetch It, the Willie Best, the Hattie McDaniels, to find out about who they were, separate from the stereotypes that they had to play. And I started to find out a lot of depth about who they're about. So my concern about tap was a similar thing in terms of this American art form that's really incredible, that's really a high level of art. Now, as we move into the 70s, tap dancing started to come back a little bit. There's a little bit on Broadway, but in terms connected to the downtown dancing, a lot of white women started discovering tap and started doing performances and found some of these older, mainly Black men as mentors to perform with. So it was coming back in that realm. But that was kind of bothering me because, but I need to see some more Black folks doing this thing, So I met the guy, Tony White. I was working with him. When I worked at NBC, this is in the mid 60s, and you didn't see a lot of tap around. One of the acts that used to be on the Tonight Show was an act called Hines, Hines, and Dad. Okay. It was Gregory Hines, Maurice Hines, and their father. And this is a point, I didn't see a lot. I remember thinking, and Gregory's the same age I am. He was. I mean, okay, these guys, they know the real thing. But, they weren't doing a lot. They kind of came back in the scene in the late 70s. So my research about Black performance, I taught a course for many years about it, was to bring some awareness to so many artists who went before us and what they did, and also in terms of tap. Now, over the years, things have changed, and particularly as we move into the 90s and then bringing the noise, bringing the funk and Savion and stuff that when Gregory got back on the scene, and Gregory chose the model like Sammy Davis. He tried to do everything. Mm-hmm. He did the best he could to bring tap back on the scene, too. And then the tap festivals, and then there's a whole slew of younger people of all cultures and backgrounds who've been studying tap and doing it. So I feel the form is important in that respect as an indigenous African-American art form that a lot of people do. And to this day, there's still people going, oh, is tap dance still going on? So there's that. And then because I was lucky enough to meet the Nicholas brothers, to meet Leonard Reed, or meet Marion Coles, Mabel Lee, some of these veterans who moved on, it's continuing their legacy. And also it's a great form. It's incredible what it is. It's an amazing art form that, needs to be talked about and appreciated. And anybody, can do it. But it has its roots, in Black culture, and it's important. So and I'm not alone in this passion, It's important kind of thing. And it's interesting because now I'm older, so it's another generation of all backgrounds getting into this too. And there's one fellow, a friend of mine who has a podcast, and he was talking about some folks still have a negative thing about, and somebody has a radio show and was putting tap dancing down, and we still. So anyway.
It's interesting. Is that why you love it so much? Did you fall in love with it? I mean, for me, I just remember watching tap dancing and thinking it's magic. I want to be able to try that. That just seems so cool. That was kind of, and I loved all of the movies and shows that I saw it in. And then as I, got into tap dancing, and I still am educating myself, on the art form. I don't know everything and everyone that, made it the art form that it is. But for you, was it a moment of wonder? Was it the fact that it is so connected to Black culture and Black history? Like, what about it do you personally love?
Well, as a kid, tap dancing, you saw it was all over the place in the 50s. So my introduction was a combination of seeing Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, the Step Brothers, the Nicholas Brothers. And I just loved the rhythms and sounds of it. I wanted to be a drummer when I was a kid. My father says, no, it's too much noise to drum. So, the rhythms and drumming. So I just loved it like many people, because tap dancing was all over the place and many people just love it, So when I studied as a kid in Harlem, at Mabel Hart's dance studio in Harlem between the ages of like 11, 12, 13, I enjoyed it. I think another reason I enjoyed doing it at that point because I was, let's use the term, I was husky. I won't say fat, but I was husky. And I was heavy, until I was 13. But I did like moving. So since sports intimidated me, tap dancing was movement.
Yeah.
It was something to move around. And I was kind of good at it, So as a kid, it meant something. And even for the years when I didn't do it, I still loved seeing it because it was just enjoyment to see, even without appreciating the total history of it.
Yeah.
And then, appreciating the history of it is another element, and having known so many people in the form. But it's, it's connected to jazz. It's connected to so many things that are part of what this country's come up with creatively, And, it's just, in the music of it, the fact, and now at the point where, I tell people I'll try to tap dance to anything. Mm-hmm. I like soft shoe. The idea of making your own kind of rhythms. Now, because so many different people do tap from so many different cultures, it's a fascinating thing to see. And when it's done well, the audience really enjoys it. When you do something, and again, as a performer, you understand when you do something people love, it's gratifying, it's addictive, and it's spiritual.
Yeah.
It's rhythm. It's the heartbeat.
That's very true. The heartbeat. That is a very good way to put it. Very good way to put it. I'm going to take a drastic turn now from tap dancing to Sesame Street. You were a stage manager for 20 years on Sesame Street. You were also an associate director, actor, and choreographer for the show. How did you get involved? Or how did you find your way to Sesame Street?
Can you tell me how to get to... I have to stop and think. Well, it's funny. When in my 20s, I was freelancing and then had my 8x10 and, you're sending pictures all over the place. And so you're knocking on doors, you're trying to do something. And sometimes something comes around the corner, right? So when Sesame Street first aired, I was already, grown. The show was kind of interesting to me. So there was a period of time I would send letters to different production companies, when I was a stage manager / AD looking for work. And I remember sending a letter to Children's Television Workshop, and they got to thank you very much, blah, 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 blah. So I had been working at Channel 11 as an associate director / stage manager. And one year we did a telethon, and it was in the window of FAO Schwartz, a big toy store. And I was one of the main stage managers for the telethon. We actually had a suite in the plaza to stay. So there were other stage managers that did different shifts. And one of the stage managers was a woman, if I'm correct, Lisa Simon. I think she was the stage manager. She was a freelance stage manager working on this telethon. The telethon's done. A few days later, I get a phone call, as I remember, from this woman, Lisa. And she said she'd seen me walking across Lincoln Center. She remembers me working on the telethon. Anyway, it turns out she was freelancing, but she was also an associate producer on Sesame Street. So she called me out and she said, would you like to work on Sesame Street? I went, let me think. Yeah. And, these are how things happen, where you just, and that's how I got, and this is how I got on Sesame Street. Now, the deal was, Sesame Street had been on, this is 1978, been on for like 9 years. They had 2 stage managers. The show was so big, it didn't have one stage manager, it had 2 stage managers, a production stage manager that set everything up, and then the other stage manager who ran the floor. And the stage managers were these twins, the O'Brien brothers, Chet and Mortimer O'Brien, who had been dancers. They had been dancers in vaudeville. And evidently a lot of dancers, when the work fell off, became stage managers because movement, putting it all together.
Wow.
So they were in their late 60s. Chet was a production stage manager, and his brother, Mortimer, better known as Snooky, ran the floor.
Okay.
Well, they'd been around, been doing this for a little while, and Snooky was getting to the point where he didn't want to work 5 days a week. He would take a day off. So they were finding stage managers to fill in for Snooky on his day off. And that's how I got hired, to fill in for Snooky. Chet was there every day, but I would fill in for Snooky. I was one of a few different stage managers that would fill in for him. Yeah. And then the thing evolved where I became the Friday guy. In the beginning, it was sporadic when I got there. Then I got to the point, Snooky worked from Monday to Thursday, and I was there on Fridays. And that was the case for many years. And then, both of them had been dancers. Chet had been married to Marilyn Miller. I just watched her in the movie on TCM. So he had all these vaudeville stories he would tell me. And then, I met Snooky every now and then. So that's how that began. And then in the early days, you could do different things. A few times I worked as an AD in the control room. And when I think back on it, maybe they were hoping I could move to become a director. I wasn't thinking about that at that point. But they knew, so as time went on, Savion got on Sesame Street. That's how I got to know Savion Glover. He was on Sesame Street while he was doing Jelly's Last Jam on Broadway. And they knew that the people on Sesame Street knew I did clowning and tap or whatever. So a couple of times I was on Sesame Street playing Savion's teacher, which is, what could I teach Savion, right? But it was a flashback.
Yeah.
A flashback. And then a couple of times I did a little bit of choreography. I did something for Snuffy, Snuffleupagus, a tap thing. And then there was a song, and it's on YouTube.
I was going to say, I have to YouTube all of this now after this conversation.
There's a thing on YouTube for the number 13. So the proposal had passed, but there was a song written as a doo-wop song, 1313, for Bob. Lilius White was on the show at the time, Lilius, and the woman who played, and Allison, who I forgot the character. So they asked me to choreograph a doo-wop routine for the 3 of them to this number 13. And I created this doo-wop number for the 3 of them. And it was great because Bob was not a natural dancer, but he's very earnest in doing it. And I think it's on. So I was on Sesame Street about 20 odd years. I mean, about 12 of them were great years. Everything has its time, and then things change, whatever. But anyway, that's how that happened. And then, so many people I met who came on the show, and then, I got to know Savion through that. And Gregory was on once. I think I gave you some pictures of me with Gregory and Savion. So that's that. And so that was happening while I was also adjuncting, teaching a couple different places and freelancing, doing other stuff. It was all part of like all these different things I was doing.
So you weren't bored?
Around. No, I wasn't, And the great thing about Sesame Street, you would show up. Who's going to be in the show today? Who were the, some of the people who came through. It was just amazing. And then Roscoe Orman, who played Gordon, he was the 3rd actor to play Gordon. Matt Robinson, who was the original Gordon, who was one of the writers first in the show, wrote a play about Stephen Fetchit. And if people can look up who Stephen Fetchit is, but Stephen Fetchit played one of these negative stereotypes, whatever, in Hollywood. But it was a complicated person.
Wow.
So Matt Robinson wrote a solo piece about Stephen Fetchit that Roscoe did. And Roscoe I was hired to do movement for Roscoe for this Stephen Fetchit piece. And at the time, I just completed my master's at NYU, and my master's is about Stephen Fetchit and Burt Williams. So the thing about Sesame Street, it went beyond just there, the connections. To this day, I know Roscoe. Jim Henson, I had actually auditioned for the Muppets years before for Jim Henson. I told him about my experiences auditioning for him and how they gave me the greatest rejection letter. It was a very apologetic letter saying, no, you're probably a really wonderful person, just can hire you now. And he said, so I told him, yeah, I auditioned for you years ago and you had the greatest rejection letter. And he told me, oh, we hated auditioning people because we knew how hard it was for folks. So.
Oh my gosh. Like besides that experience, like what was Jim Henson and Frank Oz, like what were they like?
Oh boy, that's a whole book right there. I mean, Jim Henson, he, first of all, Bert and Ernie was Jim Henson and Frank Oz, right? The dynamics between them was the dynamics between them, the way in which they worked with each other. Jim Henson's a very nice guy. He knew he was very clear. He created a whole technique about puppetry on camera, so he was great to work with. Frank Oz had kind of a dry sense of humor that was interesting. The core people, Jim Henson, Frank Oz, Richard Hunt, Jerry Nelson, those are the core four guys. Then, the name's on the tip of my tongue. She's also an actress who was on a soap opera for many years. Fran Brill was early on as one of the women Muppeteers who did a lot of acting too. So what was great about them is the banter that would go on. The joking or the cracks they would make with each other behind the scenes and stuff. All well-meaning, but very clever. And then there's John Stone, who's also one of the creators of Sesame Street. And all the dynamics that went down there was just, and then there's Carol Spinney, who, Big Bird, he's doing this all the time, So it was, there's stories, man.
Yeah, I just think it would be amazing. I mean, not that any world is perfect, because nothing's perfect. And as you said, nothing also lasts forever. Like it goes through periods, but to be in that environment with so many creative people must have just been so energizing and inspiring.
Well, it was great because, it was John Stone was one of the creators of the show. Now, John Stone goes back to Captain Kangaroo. There's a lineage, Howdy Doody, which had Bob Keeshan's original Clarabelle, and Bob Keeshan goes into Captain Kangaroo, and John Stone worked in that, and then Sesame Street comes along. So John Stone was one of the writers too. He was one of the directors, but he was, basically the actors had the script. They'd memorize it. Then the day of the shoot, he'd come out, block the stuff, work with them. But a lot of time, and he was known, he had this big beard, and he always had a pencil in his beard because he was known on the spot to edit the script.
Wow. He
could just, let's do this. And it wasn't like he was upset with people.
Yeah.
It was like, it was terrible. No, he just knew how to get to their point. And I was told when he would give notes, his famous thing was SHS. And he would indicate on the strip, and SHS stood for ship has sailed. In other words, this is where the scene ended, but you kept going to there. But the ship sailed here. Yeah. So that was a great thing to study, though. How to let's cut this out, whatever. How to get to whatever. Chet, production stage manager. He talked often about show business and the whole idea about a lot of directors cut too much. You need to have both people in the shot so you see the reaction. Don't cut back and forth. It blows the joke. Mm-hmm. So a lot of savvy things I just picked up on there. And of course, the cameraman, Frankie Biondo, who's still working on the show.
Wow.
There was a camaraderie. The rap party was something else. And then the rap party had an X-rated Muppet show. That was, hook 'em Muppets and all these different things. It was always fun.
Oh my gosh, that's hysterical.
But there was a window when it was fun like that, and then it did change. Part of it was people passed on, different producers came, and then they had to kind of update things. And then, Barney was competition, they had to start to change things to compete with that, and some things changed. But it was, the heyday was there's a funny story. Well, so many stories to tell, but I was on the set one day, and a woman was sitting on the steps, 1, 2, 3 steps, and I started talking to her. Hi, how you doing? My name's Hank. What's your name? She said, my name's Carolyn. Oh, it's nice meeting you. And blah, blah, blah. And I was semi-flirting with her, just talking, whatever. And then she left, and then Bob McGrath comes over to me, and she says, have you seen Carolyn Kennedy? Carolyn Kennedy? No, over. A lot of people named Kennedy. And I went, I was talking to this Carolyn. That's Carolyn Kennedy?
Oh, my gosh.
I'm flirting because she was working on the show, but she was just hanging out, so a lot of different people came on to work on the show. And then some people were kind of nervous. It was interesting working with some people, helping them out because they were nervous working with the puppets and stuff, So, yeah.
Well, I can imagine that's a lot of pressure. One, because it's a different environment, and I'm sure they realize that setting things up for the puppets isn't necessarily easy, so they don't want to take too much time. And then also it's for kids. So there's also like pressure of doing something, nice in that sense. I can imagine that being a little stressful.
Yeah, particularly when the guests were on, we did the best we could to make them feel at home and to help them out. I remember Isaac Stern was on, and he entrusted me with his Stradivarius or whatever. It's kind of like, oh no, or whatever you did. Okay, keep an eye on it. Yes.
Yes.
Martina Navratilova wanted a glass of carrot juice. Mr. Rogers was on. He really talked like that. Oh, nice meeting you, Hank. You're a very nice person.
Oh, how sweet. Oh, gosh. Was there someone where like you just could not get them on script, like they just ad-libbed the whole entire time, having fun with the case, with the different Muppets?
Trying to think. We had Cab Calloway on once with the two-headed monster cooperation, and every take he did was a little different, but it was okay.
Yeah.
He was in terms of, most of the people, would stay on script. Sometimes the great job as a stage manager is, you're the intermediary. So, the director comes out on the set, blocks everything. I keep track of stuff. If we have extras, I figure out when the cutie extras come in for the shot and whatever. Then the director goes in control room. I mean, now directors can work on the set, but go in control room, then I'm on the floor. And then John would say, it's in your capable hands, just tell us when everything's ready so we can roll tape. So we would roll tape, and then we shoot certain scenes, and if the actors would mess up, depending on who the director is, the director in the headset would go, would you tell that son of a gun, blah, 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 blah. And then I walk over to him. The director would like to know if perhaps you could do this differently, because you have to
You have to translate.
Yeah, you have to translate. I had a job once. I was freelancing when the conventions were happening in 1976. I was working Meet the Press at the Republican in Washington, right? Mm-hmm. And Nelson Rockefeller was on the panel, and I was stage managing, and he had his microphone. He kept hitting the microphone. So the director said, during the commercial break, run over to Rockefeller and tell him I'll hit the mic. So I said to him, I'm not running over towards any political person because, Secret Service is going to I'll calmly go over to him,
Yeah, calmly. Yeah.
I'm not going to run over to,
I'm not risking my life over a
because all these guys talking in their cufflinks and stuff, around.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so with all of these different experiences and all of the different genres that you've worked in the performing arts, is there something that you've yet to really explore that you want to explore?
I'm at a point now where I miss not having taught for a long time. I'm missing working with a group of people, and there's a part of me that, and it's kind of semi-working on it, I would love to make a musical.
Ooh.
Put together music. I've done little short things, but because, the heyday of musicals, they knew what they were doing. There was problems with them. There's differences and stuff. And you and I had conversations about the two different West Side Stories. But I feel nowadays, in terms of pulling, it comes back to my variety show thing.
Yeah.
How do you present something well and tell stories, with music and dance and sound and stuff like that. So something in that realm is percolating with me, or even in terms of stuffing museums or having interactive exhibit, having to do with how I grew up and stuff that influenced me, So, yeah, there's something with, music and dance and movement,
Mm-hmm.
kind of at this stage of the game of my life, bringing together the stuff I've seen or whatever, and also I feel the need to, I've done a few things, add to the mix of what's out there now.
Yeah.
And also there's been a number of things I've been involved in the past few years, documentaries, where I'm talking about something happened 50 years ago. Sometimes I'm kind of setting the record straight or filling out the picture, because sometimes it's easy to simplify matters, which you can all fall the trap of doing, but bringing, broad perspective of stuff. So, yeah.
That sounds great. So if people want to learn more about you or see more about your projects, where can they find you? Because you also have a podcast on YouTube that people can subscribe to.
Yeah, I haven't done it for a while. There's a thing I did for a little while called Hanging with Hank. I have a YouTube channel that probably now there's another Hanging with Hank, because there's more than one Hank Smith out there. But if you go on YouTube and type in Hanging with Hank, chances are mine might come up the quickest. So I have little videos that I did on there, and there's a blog I was doing for a little while. But it's nothing, all of it's kind of relatively inactive now, So, but if you type in my name and tap, certain things pop up,
Well, I can include all of that in the show notes, including the correct link to Hanging with Hank with our Hank Smith, so that you can find all of those great conversations. Thank you so much for just your time and these wonderful stories. And I know I'm just like the tip of the iceberg. I know there's so much more, but I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your friendship. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Create Outside the Box. Please subscribe, rate, and share our podcast. You can listen to Create Outside the Box on Spotify, Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Check us out on our Creative Operations YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to watch our interviews. You can find and follow Creative Operations on our Facebook page and on Instagram at @CO_Creative Operations. For more information about Creative Operations, please visit www.creative-operations.org.